How is everyone? I'm Xanthus, aka Isaac, the Sorcerer of Tea, and World Anvil's social media manager. I'm joined by Eric Eldritch Crow from the Dice Knights podcast and the Playcaster Society. I'm really delighted to have him with me. Um,
Why,
so,
thank you.
Tell us a little bit about what you do. You've got a podcast that you are involved in, the Dice Knights.
So Dice Knights podcast is sort of a two-part podcast. We have hour-long chats about basically topics about our D&D games. So we'll chat about homebrew rules, creating creatures, like tips and tricks that we've learned playing the game. We've been playing for 2 years, and my group runs very well together that way. So we decided to start the podcast. And then the other half that kind of sparked the whole idea for it was a in-character talk show. So it was basically two hosts, myself playing a lich, my friend Chris playing a beholder, running an interview like talk show out of the yawning portal.
Sounds
So
really awesome.
yeah, so we get to interview people's characters instead of just the people playing them, and interview dead adventurers, villains too. So we get a couple of GMs on. We're looking for more guests always, so you can find us through our social media. Um, yeah.
All right. Well, reason I brought you along here today is to talk about our topic of the month, which all through this month has been coins and currency. We had the awesome Professor Lynn Foxall, who came along to talk about it. Janet's been emceeing, but she's away in Malta, so I get to have fun and play while she's away. I am off to the side of the screen. I've just got a message from my producer.
Yeah,
Let me check that. I am a little bit. I can move over a bit more.
I am also a little off-centered.
Um, let's move over more. There we go. Hopefully, I'm in screen now.
Nope, other way.
Yep.
I'm just like sliding my webcam.
There we go. You're mostly
Actually,
centered now.
it's like the slow crawl shake. I love it.
All right.
There we go. Much better.
Awesome. So, I'm going to remember how English works. So, we're talking about how you can use coins and looking at fiction today. That's what we'll be focusing on. How fiction's used coins and currency. Some great examples, some terrible examples, some weird examples, examples that didn't really think it through, and examples that shouldn't have done it at all. So, I'd like to start with a question that's always really interesting to me. In fantasy and science fiction, you kind of have this element where technology or magic makes currency really easy to counterfeit. Um, have you seen any great examples or terrible examples of how fiction has dealt with this problem?
Oh, yes. There is a book series by, oh, I believe the author's full name is L.E. Modesitt Jr. It's called the Imager Portfolio, and it actually opens where the magic system is a bit fluid and it's never fully defined, but effectively, magic users are able to image things into existence. Basically, they imagine it and it exists, but in order to do so, they have to pull materials from the surrounding world to create the thing.
Oh, okay.
And metals are actually one of the hardest things to do because they are either rare or extremely difficult to pull and that sort of thing. So there are imagers who actually start out by counterfeiting copper coins and silver coins and work their way up. And part of their training is actually being able to counterfeit coins because moving up the ranks of like rare metals, it gets significantly more difficult and your powers are kind of like flexing a muscle that way.
Hmm.
So that's one example I know of that has done magical counterfeits really well as part of a plot device in long form storytelling. I don't really know of any others that have done it or even addressed it, really.
Hmm.
Um, that's the one good example I've got.
I know Harry Potter does touch upon it a little bit in that there are spells to duplicate money, but they can't do it perfectly, and so over time the money degrades and it ultimately loses its value. I think the twins get ripped off at one point with leprechaun coins that disappear after a few
Yeah,
days.
yeah, I
Um,
do remember that.
and so having it be part of the magic system that coins cannot be duplicated, or honestly, I don't think anything can be duplicated perfectly in Harry Potter, eliminates that problem. In science fiction, I guess it's less of a matter of duplication and more of a problem of rarity, because you get to a big enough stage of technology and resources, and gold and silver are fairly much everywhere.
Yep. And it could even possibly be that at a certain level of sci-fi, your currency is digital.
Mm.
So, I mean, suddenly counterfeiting gets really weird in a digital space. Like, part of me doesn't even know how I would conceptualize counterfeit digital currency, but part of me also knows it would definitely be possible and possibly easier than counterfeiting physical currency.
Mm.
So,
Um, I can think of one that did this with physical was Star Trek. You've got the Ferengi currency, which is Latinum.
oh yeah, the Latinum
Uh,
bars.
yeah, so like using a very rare resource in contrast to a very common resource. I think they call it gold pressed Latinum, but the gold is so incredibly valueless. It's just like a wrapper. Um, because
Hmm.
like you get to enough asteroids, there's a lot of gold floating around up there.
Oh yeah.
Um, I know one of the. I'm no expert in cybersecurity, but talking a bit more on your digital counterfeiting, I know blockchain offers some ways around being able to counterfeit, and then it becomes more an issue of stealing it than it does counterfeiting it. But that kind of moves me into the next question, actually. Um, Something that is interesting to me is how currencies can kind of reflect the society's priorities and also what is available around them. So, how, drawing on any examples you can think of, how do you think world builders can create a currency that kind of reflects the flavor of their society, and integrates that stuff?
Okay, so there are I've kind of broken this down into pairs because I find there's two different almost design philosophies behind currency, one for storytelling and one for game design. And that's because in storytelling, you almost have to put a little bit more detail into it than you would otherwise, because you need to be able to explain it directly to your reader without them
Mm,
experiencing it firsthand. Whereas in a gaming scenario, your player can actually become a part of the transaction process
mm,
and gets a more tactile feel for how the currency works in that sense. So effectively, like my best examples off the top of my head are for really good ways that have done it in both scenarios. Patrick Rothfuss and his Kingkiller Chronicle has fantastic explanations of currency because they're short, they're to the point, and they explain the exchange rate between countries when the main character is traveling around, which is not something you see often in world building.
mm.
For the most part, it's homogenous currency, which I love in certain scenarios and hate in others. We'll get to that later. But a game scenario that's done it really well, which has a homogenous currency, Fallout, using bottle
Mm-hmm.
caps, where bottle caps are this weird instance where it's something super common, but not something that's easy to reproduce in the Fallout setting. So they become very tradable just as a mark of currency, and then you have other trade besides that that kind of fills in the value here and there, I guess you could say.
Mm.
Um, but what I like seeing in terms of this design philosophy is for narratives, you explain a little bit more so that people get a full concept of the currency that they're using. Or in game design, you can get away with using a homogeneous currency because players need something that's easy to dig into, easy to remember, and they don't necessarily need it explained to them right away because they're just going to see the transactions play out and be a part of it as well.
No, that makes total sense. It gives you, I guess, more ability to create something more complex because you actually have time to introduce it to your players. Whereas in a book, of course, the bane of every writer is the world building exposition dump, and you've got to avoid those if you want to have an engaging book. Um, Say even worse, a problem I think would be film because you have so little time. You have a 3 to 2 hour space where you've got to introduce all this world building, unless you're writing a
Oh yeah.
big trilogy. Pardon. You've got to introduce all this stuff really quickly, and you've got to establish to the viewer why it's important and also how it reflects the society. Um, for example, something I can think of is the Fifth Element, which touches on it very briefly in the multi-pass that people use as like a credit card and also a passport, and that is explained a little bit and introduced almost humorously. And like, if anyone's ever run into a part of World Anvil you're not supposed to be on, you've probably seen the multi-pass video that Demetrius has up there of the character who's not versed in the culture, explaining a multi-pass kind of very simplishly by pointing to it, saying it's a multi-pass, and it's a humorous scene. So you introduce it really quickly and humorously, and it reflects the society. We know everything's quite digital. Um, so yeah,
Sorry,
you can certainly do that. No worries.
I'm just turning down my audio ever so slightly for chat.
Oh, we're a bit loud now.
I tend to have my volume up for recording so that I
Alright,
can
no worries.
editor have fun with that. But
Hopefully that's
yeah,
better for chat. I can't see chat myself because my computer will throw a fit if I also have Twitch up. So let me
yeah,
know
I just
anything.
pulled it up. But the multipass is a fantastic example of doing homogeneous currency right. Like it is such a great idea and such a humorous beat that gets repeated throughout the movie. And at the same time, you can have the same thing happen in not a great way. I'm so sorry, but directly in Harry Potter. We're gonna move into this because the one thing about Harry Potter is that the numbers thrown out in terms of galleons always arbitrary because we never have any context for it.
Hmm.
There's this point where like when your main character is legitimately rich, numbers just become arbitrary.
Mm.
And it's like part of that is focusing on different aspects of the storyline, because you have to trim that down. I would never expect J.K. Rowling to write a little, even short sentence on how currency works because that's not the main focus. But it is a thing that can pull you out of world building when all of a sudden somebody says, "Oh yeah, I'm going to pay 10 galleons," and like you don't know if that buys you a cup of coffee or a house.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a challenge I think in having a rich protagonist too, is that money doesn't propose a narrative challenge a lot of the time, unless it's an absurdly large amount of money. Um, for example, Skyrim. Skyrim's I'll bring up, and not. I think it's a terrible example of this, in that you can go steal a few dungeons worth of gold, and you suddenly have enough to flood the market in any town. And
Yep.
that's the problem, is that money becomes no obstacle, and therefore it is no longer a narrative pressure. And it, in some quests, you're even like, oh, money, spend money, give this person money, and it's like, well, I have 80,000 gold coins on me right now. This isn't a problem.
And if
Um,
you run out of money, it's like I'll go trade one of the like 99 iron swords I keep in my inventory
yeah,
because there's
or
other
some of the
places you
dragon
can.
bones. I know, because there's also the problem of like merchants do not have an incredibly large amount of money. Like it's like $1,000 on most of them, and so that implies for your world building there, as well as your mechanics, that $1,000 or 1,000 gold coins is quite a lot of money. Um, and I think like 8,000 buys you a house or something, um, somewhere in that range. But you then break your own world building by the fact that you, the protagonist, can end up with such a ridiculous amount of money, and it's not funny. Um, so you've got to deal with the contradiction of terms there. You can't have it say one thing and then another be the reality of your plot.
Yeah, that's the truth. And I'm gonna jump into one really weird example where it's not bad, it's just kind of a disconnect between like the point of the world building, I guess. And it's Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn novels.
Mm.
I brought this up briefly before, but Brandon Sanderson does this fantastic thing in the Mistborn series where he bases his entire magic system around metals and metal shapings that people
Mm.
ingest in order to perform certain abilities. You have two different types of this. You have Furukami, which is sort of internalized to yourself, and you have Allomancy, which is sort of abilities that show themselves externally. So pushing on objects, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, the minute you make metals the source of superpowers, is the minute metals are no longer getting used as coins, but coins still exist.
Mm. That's a yeah. I haven't thought about it like that, but that is a serious problem because uh, it's rather like if you were using pharmaceutical drugs as currency. They're far more valuable to eat them to not die from like you using antibiotics as coins wouldn't really be a great solution. They're much more useful as a consumable product than as a static currency that you put in a bank account. Um,
Yeah, and for someone who can't afford to get like, say they can't afford to buy pre-made gold shaving vials down, what's to stop them from stealing a gold coin, shaving the plating off it, dropping it into its own vial of alcohol, and downing that?
mm,
Like, all of a sudden, minted coins seem like a really bad idea because you have a bunch of street superheroes who could just use them for superpowers.
mm,
Um, I mean, the abilities are a bit more rare than that, but it still poses a problem in terms of like repercussions for world building, which is why like you said starting out, currency should always reflect its culture. It should reflect what a society deems important enough to trade and what a society deems important enough to trade for.
mm.
So I was doing a bit of research to prep for the stream actually, and I realized something kind of interesting. Currency always stems out of base needs first. So currency was food, it was cattle, it was resources first. And then once a society's base needs are met to a certain degree, currency moves into luxury items like
Mm,
gold, like silver, like stuff they consider valuable but might not have value in everyday life.
mm,
Um, so depending on what societies you're building, you should really consider like, okay, are they worried about their base needs for survival first? In which case, their base needs for survival become their currency.
mm.
So, for example, I've in my setting of Araxis, I've currently built a couple of desert-based people where they trade water, or they'll trade food, or they'll trade locations. Um, one society is built entirely around the idea of a classic dowry system for marriage, but they're water reserves instead of coins
Ah,
or instead of wealth.
mm,
Another society is built entirely around protecting my equivalent of the Nile. So they make sure that people can't take more water than they should be in order to upset the ecosystem and upset the entire balance of the desert. So there's a lot of different ways to play it. There's also another society in my setting that is based around elemental crystal. That's a big theme for my setting. And so elemental crystal kind of becomes its own commodity. And this is going to get into something I wanted to bring up later on that like currency doesn't just mean coins. It can also be social currency, it can be favors. There are game systems that use information as currency. Like there's a lot of different ways to do it. You just have to consider what is most important to the society that's using it first
yeah,
off.
exactly. That actually leads me into an example I love personally, which is the Dark Souls series. And in
Yes.
Dark Souls, souls are currency, but they are also the basic need of everyone. And they are simultaneously the only thing that's worth enough for anyone to bother trading, and also so critical that everyone wants them. Um, and so that reflects both the world because you have this setup where coinage is not really worth anything. The only coins you run into the game are ones you destroy to give yourself luck because they're no longer worth anything as a currency. Uh,
Yep.
but because there's no inherent value in them if there's no system to uphold them, and the system has collapsed. You've got no kings or armies supporting trade. You've just got the thing that people need, and if they can't cash it in, they know they still have a use for it. um,
Yeah.
and souls, and also it reflects the flavor of the setting. Because of course the idea of trading souls is very thematic. It creates a kind of darker atmosphere than if you were trading something else. Um, just inherently by the idea of it, what it implies to the player. And so that I think fills a lot of these examples, and I find it. I personally think it's a really good example of how currency is part of the world building, part of the mechanic, and also part of the theming. Um, so we talked very briefly. Actually, you mentioned exchange rates and stuff like that. And different currencies should exist really in the realistic world, but you don't necessarily need to be realistic. There's the understanding sometimes that unrealism is better for the story.
Yeah.
But sometimes it can be really overwhelming, but useful to develop different currencies and work out how they exchange. You mentioned the one example. Have you seen any other places this has been done well?
Um, in terms of exchange, I can't think of any more off the top of my head. I know I have read them, but like, oh, it's been so long. But I think one place that it gets done constantly is actually D&D. And D.
Hmm.
And that's because in D&D you have a copper, silver, electrum, gold system where moving through an electrum is almost always ignored because it doesn't fit a system here because everything is denominations of 10. 10 copper to a silver, 10 silver to a gold, and then electrum is the weird odd man out where it's like 5 electrum to a gold piece or something like that. Anyways, but that is in itself a system containing a currency exchange. But there comes a point, oh, and then there's platinum on top of that, which is 10 gold to a platinum piece. But there comes a point where money becomes so arbitrary, even in D&D, that everybody just converts it to gold pieces because it's the easy kind of cultural go-to in terms of fiction.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. Like, actually, a lot of fiction has the whole gold system. I was actually going to talk about that one, but later. But well, yeah, let's jump into that one. The gold, silver, copper standard has kind of become a thing. I read some people contending it's D&D's fault, that it has been influenced by D&D. I don't think that's 100% true because it was also a thing in some places in real life. Not to
Yeah,
exactly the level that fantasy settings tend to have it be. Um, I guess
actually,
partially that would be because really, if you're the average person, you never saw a gold coin, and so it wasn't really that important to you. Um,
well, and the standard for this too is actually historically based because I can't remember what century it was, but there was a point where, at least over in Europe, I think it was like 16 to 1800s range ish, gold became a standard. It was the standard by which currency was valued, but they weren't trading in pure gold, they were trading in banknotes, very much like we do now. Our
hmm,
current banknote system is all based around the value of gold to some degree or another. And so all of our banknotes effectively represent paper gold
hmm.
because of that system. And so using gold for a standard has been a historical zeitgeist for minimum 100 years or more, actually, probably closer to 150. So using gold as a standard is by no means a D&D thing, it's a history thing. D&D just sort of absconded with it for the sake of gaming.
Yeah, I guess it's more a D&D thing to have this particular system of gold into silver into copper. Um, and I don't actually know how much that was a thing in real life. It's not something I've researched. I know silver currency was a large part of the trade in the Mediterranean, more than gold for a long time. Mostly because of the Venetians used gold. Used silver instead of gold coins, and their currency was the most widely accepted, just because they had the most trading power behind them, and they had the most consistently minted coins. Um, has there been many alternatives that you've seen in fiction to this idea of gold, silver, copper?
Um, there's been like the classic credit system. There's been a few where it was like trading physical items.
Barter system.
There, Barter system. I've seen a few people do it with like seers and hags and oracles, where it's like you trade a secret, which is
Oh,
very
okay.
fun.
That's a
Um,
fun thematic idea for the right type of universe.
yeah. So it really depends on the system. I know I play tested a game last night for a friend where they didn't have a currency system. They just had a wealth score because they
Okay.
knew that at some point your wealth is arbitrary, effectively, in an RPG. So what they decided was, okay, if you want to buy an object that has a lower rating than your wealth score, you can just do it without issue. But if you want to buy an object that's higher than your wealth score, you have to roll for it.
Hmm.
And I
That's an
actually really
interesting
liked that
system.
because, yeah, it also means that, like, flavor wise, you're not just spending gold, you're spending political capital, you're spending social capital. You can buy information. Like, I like being able to incorporate things like that. One idea I had kind of tinkering with the idea of different currencies was a setting where overpopulation is an issue. So you're using ashes, urns, and bones of the dead as a currency because they are the most common thing around that has any kind of value.
That's an interesting idea. Very morbid, but an interesting
It
idea.
is super morbid. It is definitely a very pseudo gothic
Hmm.
aesthetic, I guess. But in that regard, it's a great way to have currency reflect setting.
Yeah,
Like I
it
said, for the
is.
setting I'm tinkering with, different types of magic crystals have different values, and different values to different people. So they'll often get traded for the sake of powering magical items, but they'll also just get traded for the sake of being pretty gems you can slap on a necklace.
Hmm. I know
It,
that was something Janet discussed in one of her coin streams. Is gemstones don't like in general work great for a standardized currency, simply because aren't standardized. There's the biggest problem. Unless you have a crystal, for example, in my world, you can to a certain degree standardize magical crystals called Viz, because you can change their shape with magic, and therefore you can turn them into the right shape or size so that they're all consistent. But for our own real life gemstones, a lot of the value of them comes from clarity, color, and perfection, like whether or not
yeah,
they have teeny little fractures, and that's not really stuff you can standardize. But um, you can certainly look at things beyond that. For example, a real life example people tote out a lot of the time is that uh, cocoa beans used to be used as a currency by the Mayans. Um,
hmm
but you could go even more diversely. We talked about souls earlier from Dark Souls, the bones, or ashes, as you were just mentioning. Um,
blood in a vampire
yeah,
setting.
yeah, that's actually a really interesting one. Um,
Blood packs could easily be a thing that's just like, oh, if you want access to a certain area, you have to donate blood packs to the pool. You could also do. I saw Sergeant Gaming was talking about renown, so a renown system in chat, and that's always another idea that comes up because renown, in terms of being able to pull on your reputation, is
mhm.
something that doesn't get used often enough, in my opinion. It does get used often, but I always like to see it more.
Mm. No, that's a cool one actually. Thinking more in terms of like owing someone a favor as a currency, really,
Oh
could be
yeah.
an interesting way to look at it. And I can certainly see that working in small communities, or it would be very thematic for example, a post-apocalyptic setting where there's no real value in currency of the traditional form. You've got not much use for it, but where having someone be on your side can be life-saving in certain situations.
hmm Or between artisans, trading work for work, that kind of deal. Like, I'll patch up your house, but you have to forge me the tools to do it, kind of deal.
Mm.
That's always been kind of a classic. Like, even my dad and his siblings did that because they were all tradespeople. Like, that still even happens even today. So,
Yeah, well,
um,
it makes sense, especially in situations where you know you can trust the person. Either
yeah.
because it's a small enough community, or remote enough that they can't run away, or they're related to you, or you've known them for a long time. Um, But also, I guess you could see it in terms of political systems. I guess it is used to a certain degree, even in our modern representative democracies, where you have a exchanging votes. I'll vote for your
Yeah.
bill in return for you voting for mine. Has become kind of a thing. Um,
Voting as a currency. I never thought of it that way, but yeah. Yeah, that is a whole socially constructed system for currency within government.
I'm trying to think. There was a book I did read that was a science fiction series that had voting as a thing that was traded between the noble houses of the science fiction state, and I cannot remember which series it was, but that's certainly an interesting idea as well. Your influence is something you can trade.
Yeah. Hmm, I like it. There's also a classic idea somewhat stemming from the game I played last night where if you're rolling dice for a game, a successful roll is technically could be banked as currency. It could be like, oh, you have a success that you can spend on a thing.
Mm.
So there's kind of a meta level to currency at that point as well. But back to kind of the standardized stuff, like the copper, silver, gold style system has been in place for a long time. I don't see it changing drastically. I don't see it going away anytime soon, that's for sure, because, we still run the real world on gold. Um, but it has its benefits because it's been around in the cultural zeitgeist for so long that people can see a gold system as a currency and click right in. The same way
Hmm.
people can see experience points as a currency and click right in because video games have been around long enough now. And tabletop games have been around long enough with those systems. Like most people who play a game when they're a kid are familiar with these, so it becomes a gaming shorthand to understanding the world. I feel like it falls flat when pure narratives, movies, TV, writing try to play on that because you're not getting the interactivity of the introduction. And like we talked about at the beginning, it's a window in, but it's a very particular and narrow window in my opinion.
That's true. I think also that if you're going to deviate drastically from that set of currency, you have to have a different either resource situation or social situation than to our own world to motivate that. You have to actually have a reason because it is a very simple system. Gold and silver are rare enough and pretty enough that humans like them, but not so incredibly rare that you don't see them. And gold does not tarnish. That's one of its big benefits. Gold doesn't rust or tarnish. You can't lose it rusted away. Silver tarnishes, but again, it doesn't rust, so you cannot. It is not destroyed by time. It's something that's really easy to store up and give to your children. So you've got to have a different resource situation if you want that system to not exist in your world. Silver or gold are not as common, or they're way too common, and so they're not really that worth that much. You have to think about those kind of steps of why it's different.
We actually there's an interesting thing that came up in chat from Secondhand Samurai and EDR Andrew, um, talking about who's still using the gold standard for their basis of currency. Currently, nobody in the world directly uses it. Every standard of currency is still directly influenced by it.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is pretty much the most expensive stock values on the market are gold and diamonds consistently, but diamonds aren't plentiful enough to necessarily make as huge of an impact. So you'll see stock market fluctuations based entirely around the price of gold. And when stock markets fluctuate, company values fluctuate. In some cases, currency values fluctuate if a country is heavily invested in their own stock market. Looking at you, North America. Uh, so it's that kind of deal where like it may not be direct, but it still does have repercussions. And it's something to think about again if you're doing a very developed setting, if you're doing a kind of modern era setting or you're doing a sci-fi setting, there's a lot of repercussions to the value placed on currency.
Mm.
So like take my really creepy gothic bones, ashes, and stuff idea earlier. The most common bones of the body would be the cheapest. You would have finger bones, you would have teeth, you would have certain joints and stuff like that. The bigger the bone, probably the more valuable it would be. And then I would assume something like skulls would be the most valuable because you only get one. Ribs and spines would probably be like super cheap because you have a lot of them. Um, and it's a super morbid idea, but general scarcity just determines value in a lot of the cases. And it's a fine system, but it gets cool once you start tinkering with, okay, what's scarce and why, what's readily available and why, and how do they interact.
Hmm.
So if there's something that's very valuable that is scarce and something that's not very valuable but very plentiful, in a weird turn of events, a lot of those times one will get used to represent the other,
Hmm.
like paper banknotes representing gold.
Yeah, well, just simply because population growth, you can't give everyone solid gold coins.
Yep.
I've been thinking actually, you could instantly crash your economy just by causing a plague.
Oh God, yeah.
Black Death
Yeah.
destroys global economy.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Um, Secondhand Samurai brings up in chat, would the bones need to be earned back so you don't give away family members? It would make for heavy collateral. That also can affect the setting. Like, what if you don't care about your family that much? I mean, you could have these people who are very wealthy and very ambitious, and they tend to kind of sell off the entirety of their family's remains in order to uphold that. You can have people who don't place value on the dead anymore because the dead are a currency. It becomes a very interesting social implication in that sense, and it's an extreme one, but I think it demonstrates the impacts currency and the different uses currency has as well.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. My brain is immediately going terrible places like have lots of kids and kill them to be rich. But
there
that's
would be monsters that do that exactly. And
yeah.
it makes for such an interesting story because it's like it's so different from our own moral structure where all of our currency is based on very inanimate things. Well, technically a dead body is an inanimate thing, but there's a lot of sentiment attached.
Mm,
So all of a sudden you have to make this choice of like, okay, I have to eat tomorrow. I guess I'm selling off grandma's right hand.
yeah.
And it's a terrible thing and like there's a bit of black humor to it, but at the same time it can make for some very interesting scenarios of you're about to lose everything. Do you sell your father's skull?
Mm.
There's also the idea there was a movie a while back. Oh God, I cannot remember the movie, but everybody had a scrolling number on their arm, on their forearm, and they would buy and sell years, which is a really interesting idea. If anyone in chat remembers the idea or the movie, that'd be great. But you could effectively like add to your timer basically, and it would tell you exactly when you're going to die, unless you bought more time or you could gamble your time away. So,
That's an interesting idea as well. Um pardon me. Um I think that kind of ties into something I was going to mention is something I found really interesting. I don't know if you've seen the American Gods series.
I
Um,
have.
in that money itself has become a deity because American Gods good belief creates entities out of the thing, and money is just about belief in many ways. So that's something I wanted to touch upon. Gold isn't particularly useful if you don't believe it's worth anything. Because until modern technology, it was practically pointless, except for in like ceremonial vessels you didn't want to rust or something like that. I believe it's an Asimov book where the robots have no use for gold, and eventually they decide the only thing it's useful for is making utensils for whenever humans occasionally visit, so they don't have to replace the fork knives and forks because they've got no other use. They've progressed past the industrial technology that needs gold, and they don't value it. So,
Thank you,
like,
secondhand. Apparently, it was In Time with Justin Timberlake.
ah,
Great concept, wasted on not the best actor.
that's a lot of movies. I'm still so sad that Jupiter Ascending was such a disaster.
Oh, I
Actually, that's
know.
one to think about. Jupiter Ascending has an interesting idea of currency, in that it's actually a similar idea that immortality is the only resource in the world anyone cares about, well, anyone rich, because it is the most valuable resource once you get to a certain absurd level of value. And the plot was terrible, but the world building is wonderful, and I really liked some of the world building about how it's essentially it's a very morbid idea that life is used to create immortality, and then immortality becomes a tradable good.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Immortality is very interesting as a currency because it's not something you tend to consider when building a world. Um, oh, there was another idea. I have to check my notes. There's another one. I can't remember it off the top of my head.
But
Uh,
that's I guess a scenario where belief is not as important because, like we said earlier, it's something that's actually useful. You don't have to believe in the value of the thing you know can make you live forever. Um, you know it
yeah.
makes you live forever. It has inherent value to you.
Oh, uh, best use of currency I've seen in a film in the past probably 10 years, John Wick.
Okay, I've heard some good things about
Because
that. I haven't watched the film myself, but what
it
what
has
stood out to you?
the way the use of currency dovetails directly into the storytelling and the world building. Because normally, like so far, what we've been talking about is currency as a product of world building. In this regard, currency becomes your window into how the world works. So in John Wick, there's a setup where effectively you have a interconnected society of assassins and people who do wet work and that kind of deal. This interconnected society, and basically I would just call it the underworld with a capital U because I don't have a better title for it. Um, all trades based on gold coins. But those gold coins can be used to buy weapons, they can be used to buy safety, they can be used to buy information, like they can be used to effectively call in favors, like we mentioned before. And those favors can come in the form of really anything you need. Like there's an opening scene where he calls for basically a cleanup of his house because a bunch of guys tried to raid his house, and he just hands the head of the cleaning company a stack of like 5 gold coins, which is effectively one per body. And it's like, okay, 1 gold point, 1 gold coin per body cleaned up after everything's said and done. So I would have no. The funny thing is, they never really talk about if those gold coins dovetail into like legitimate dollar currency, but they never have to because they're only ever used for that one thing. And then in John Wick 2, there's an extra coin, um, which is like a larger, almost the equivalent of a platinum coin, imagine, but it's effectively like a blood pact. Long story short, and you can call that in, and they have to do whatever you ask them to do with it. So there's degrees there, and it gives you an insight into how the world functions in the middle of a set of movies that are very heavily action based, are going just from one fight scene to another without any significant breaks other than to montage rearming and dressing in a fancy suit. But they do it so well because they have all these other little hints about
Hmm.
how the world works with, paying for favors, paying for lodging at basically an assassin's only hotel. Like all that happens. And it's great. And it's a wonderful little window. Um,
That's really a great way to world build, in my opinion, is laying, pardon me, laying things down as hints or background information or to imply a greater story. Um, it's something I was actually going to ask about. Currency isn't super important to every type of story. Sometimes it's just not like the economics of your world are not what the reader needs to know about. But you can certainly add flavor to a world still through your choice of currency.
yeah.
And this sounds like a great example of that. Like you can show that this world kind of operates on as a cohesive unit through this particular currency just by placing it there in scenes. Uh, whereas you can imply something very different by taking a different approach to it. For example, I haven't finished the movies, but in Mad Max, the newest Mad
Oh
Max,
yeah.
main character's blood is valuable. If I recall correctly, and that implies a lot about the story. Dark Souls, like we mentioned, the souls create a lot about the story. Why are they valuable? Why can you trade souls? That tells you a ton in a game that doesn't actually usually tell you anything.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, another thought was Pirates of the Caribbean, oddly, just came
hmm
to mind. I watched one of those movies last night and I realized they never explicitly use a lot of currency, but they use a lot of icons in place of it.
mm.
So the stealing of the Black Pearl, the Black Pearl becomes a currency, unfortunately, because it keeps jumping back and forth, and there's value for it, and people make deals over it. The gold medallion from the first film that can basically let people die finally. Those medallions are a currency, whether you like it or not. And people spent them and sent them around, and suddenly they realize they're cursed because of it, which is a really interesting subtheme now that I'm thinking of it. Tying currency to curse is a whole other thing too, guys. That's always fun. And it's like instant flavor where it's like I'll give an example from my own game. We were streaming on Mondays because I'm part of a horror-based D&D stream, and we were asked by a hag to retrieve her lucky coin. That it's a terrible idea. You should never do what a hag asks you to do, but we did it. And then our trickster cleric attempted to find a good way to keep the coin or that kind of thing. So, long story short, he accidentally stole an item from her because he detect magic in her lair and found a magic item that he thought she wouldn't miss, and then attempted to trade her own coin for it, basically.
I don't sound
Uh,
like that went well.
no, no, it did not go well. He basically like owes her a blood pact now, and it's really funny. But long story short, you can mess with currency a little bit if you give it significance other than as currency. Like if you give it a curse, if you give it some kind of sentimental value, if you give it something other than its base use, it immediately becomes much more interesting and can become a plot point.
I guess that's actually an. I keep going back to Dark Souls because I love it so much, but that's something in Dark Souls
Right?
is if you don't have souls, you start losing your memory. Um, and that's just, you see NPCs that this has happened to, um, and therefore you give some interesting facets to the story, and to the theming you want to go for. That's something I love talking about. And theming is really interesting, and you can use currency to theme things. Hele FR actually said, setting currency, like many things in the background, may be never shown to the player/reader, but help give foundations or change the dynamic of your world that they then see and feel without knowing that it's from the currency. And that is exactly it. Theming can be really interesting. So you can touch on anything from, the most cliche, greed, for example. We're talking about currency, we have to talk about greed as a theme, but you can also touch upon, like you said earlier, sentimentality with the bone idea,
Yeah.
memory, as in we see in Dark Souls, uh, Log Horizon, which is a isekai anime, also kind of touches on memory as a
Yeah.
theme.
Yeah. Man, it's been a while since I watched Lock Horizon, but yeah, you're right. It definitely uses memory as kind of its own, not really transaction, but it's like you give a piece of yourself to the world in order to have the abilities that you have, which
Mm.
is also very much in theme with Dark Souls now that I think about it. Because, like, in Dark Souls, like you said, souls allow you to keep your memory, but souls are also what you have to pay to get all the best gear. So, how are you going to do this? Are you going to sacrifice your humanity to get through the next area of the game? Or are you going to balance it out? Like, it's not a decision that I think would be actively made in that context for a lot of gamers, but it becomes a background context for the decision itself
Mm.
mechanically. And it's really cool. Oh, I like that.
Yeah, you can also look at it, I guess, in other ways. For
Hmm.
example, in Witcher, something I think The Witcher 3 is you run into all these different currencies and you have to exchange them to be able to use
Yeah.
them. And that's not a surface level really thing you think about, but it creates part of the theming of this is a war torn country. You have currencies from different conflicting states coming together because of people mixing, because of the war, soldiers and refugees. Um, all bringing their different currencies together, creating some support to your existing theme.
Yeah. And it's so great to see those themes come out. Like when I'm a player, I love little details. Whether it's a video game, uh, tabletop RPG, all that stuff. I also like having those little details in narrative, but they're a lot more difficult to pull in narrative because of the kind of the work doesn't get spread out between the player interacting with the narrative as much.
Mm,
The work is much more on the author to make it obvious.
mm,
So if you're creating currency for a novel or a collection of short stories, keep in mind you're going to be pulling a lot more of your own weight with this story-wise.
mm,
And especially language-wise, you have to consider how much of a block of text are you going to dedicate to explaining your currency exchange rates in a
mm,
world. And that's one thing I really liked about Patrick Rothfuss's books because of the way he was narrating. There were very quick snippets of the exchange rates throughout, and he never lore dumped it all at once. He would only explain it when the character encountered it,
mm,
which is something I really like, and it's something you don't often see in stories with omniscient narrators, because the omniscient narrator knows everything, and that's sort of a default for early writers is omniscience because the writer can know everything and they don't have to put on an air of not knowing. The problem then becomes the writer knows everything, so they want to dump everything on the page
mm.
because you get super excited over your ideas and it's a legitimate thing. Um, but it's it's a difficult thing to balance, and it's mostly a thing that's balanced through editing for narrative, I find, because that's like a second or third draft problem usually. It's definitely not a first draft problem, and it's something that can be a cool detail. It just has to be developed appropriately and kind of explained enough to understand, but not over explained to the point where it takes away from the rest of the story. And there's kind of a decently sized chunk of line there to walk, but it can still be a bit difficult in the drafting process.
Yeah, no, that's definitely part of the problem, and I think World Anvil's useful to that for that personally to me because I can resist the urge to dump it all in the narrative when I can keep track of it off screen. The reader never has to see that, because I can keep track of it otherwise, and its repercussions. For example, I think beyond theming, you can also use how people make transactions as a really great way to set up a culture. Because currency is just tied intrinsically into culture. And for example, I was reading a book recently, and one of the scenes is a battle, and they have some assistance from a foreign tribe, who most of them decide to leave, but one of the characters stays because she wants some horses, and she's like, okay, well, if you give me the horses for everyone I kill, I'll help you. Like the horses are valuable to her. It like, sets up so much world building because we don't actually know about her culture very much, but we understand immediately she comes from somewhere horses are valuable. You have this implication she cares more about horses than, say, the soldier's armor, so that they're more important to her. And also that money isn't what she's asking for, it's useful livestock. And it changes a lot of your perception of character because you can build off kind of the templates people have already in their head. Like, of course, a lot of people, like, you think horse culture, people are instantly going to have Mongolian images, and if you want to play off that, then that can be a good thing to do because you can build off preconceptions. I'm trying to think what the term is for it, um, but building off a reader or a player's preconceptions of an idea is a great way to world build, and you can do that with currency. Like we talked,
Yeah.
gold, silver. You get immediate preconceptions. People know what that kind of looks like, and so you don't have to do as much narrative exposition dumping.
I'd love to see a setting where like you use a standard like gold, silver, copper system, but copper's the most valuable.
That would be interesting, actually. I did read a little bit earlier that the first period tin was the most valuable thing in the Indonesian area, and it was used as
Yeah.
currency because they had it more plentifully than gold, but not so plentifully that it was worthless, and gold just was too rare to use as a currency. Um,
Yep. There's also trading of just raw material. Like
mm,
there was the one example I can think of is the way Crucible Steel made its way up from what would now be like the Middle East Arab Emirates area, all the way up to Norway and like classic sort of Nordic culture.
mm,
Because the Nords have some of the best examples of Crucible Steel that has lasted centuries that were rediscovered. But for the longest time, people couldn't figure out how it got there. And then they finally realized, okay, they had enough people trading from the Middle East and the Arab Emirates and going up through Europe that it sort of populated itself all the way through there as a method of creating steel.
mm,
And it was a really popular one because crucible steel is, when made properly, a ridiculously tough super steel.
mm,
Like it's tough to beat. But that in its own right becomes a currency now. It's an ability to make a thing you couldn't make anymore. It's like one part information and one part survivability plus like two parts material,
mm.
basically.
And that also creates kind of theming. If, for example, if you use Crucible Steel, or I believe it was called Damascus Steel as well, wasn't it? Um,
Damascus.
yeah, you have preconceptions with that, especially among the nerdier people. They've probably seen it. It's very beautiful. It has wavy patterns all through it, and so by knowing that, you can, instead of having to describe the damn blade, you can tell them, and the reader knows a lot more than you, and you don't have to exposition as much. And you can do that with currency too, which I guess poses one of the biggest challenges to trying to be unique. And I think sometimes world building falls on that problem of we want to be unique in all of our world building ideas, that sometimes you can just assume the standard cultural zeitgeist and not hurt your world building.
Yeah. And that's something that's why I have likes and dislikes about the D&D currency system because it's so standard that sometimes it can get annoying, but at the same time, it's so standard that it's useful.
Mm,
And there's a reason it has lasted this long. There's a reason it still exists, and it's because it makes sense. We use a base 10 number system all over the world for the most part that makes it easy for us to understand and conceptualize it. So, why are you going to actively make things more difficult for your audience to understand by trying to make it more unique?
mm. No, that's very
And that's
true. Go on, sorry.
well, that's just a point a lot of world building runs into, but it can be especially weird with math. Because if you decide, oh, everything is going to work off of sevens or 12s or 13s, like all of a sudden things get real wonky and people will automatically default to being like, okay, I know this works off sevens, but my brain keeps making it tens.
Hmm. That's something I've seen with calendars and timelines and currency exchange rates. Like, it can be interesting to mess with currency exchange, or even just currency value. But like you said with Harry Potter, if your galleons are just totally arbitrary, no one cares because you just zone out. And on the other hand, if it's too complex because you actually do try and make sense, people zone
Hmm.
out because they don't care. They don't need to know those facts to the story unless it's like super important to a particular plot point.
Yeah.
Um, Something Hele FR said, what if the currency source, material, or method of craft gets exhausted? How do you think the currency and economy will go forward without the possibility to add to economy?
Oh, I see this going one of two ways. Um, just to jump right into it, it's either the system is going to adopt whatever fills the void quickly. So whatever is next in line for most valuable and just go down the line, Or if you wipe like an entire segment of the economy, like if we suddenly ran out of valuable metals on Earth, all of a sudden the first culture to pick up something new as valuable is going to cause a cascade.
Mm.
Um, like, for example, we talked about earlier how a lot of things go from currency as base resources first, and then once base resources are plentiful enough, currency switches to leisure items. If you run out of the leisure items, or God forbid you run out of the base resource, suddenly the leisure item currency just has no reason to exist anymore. So you would flip back to the base resources. It depends on kind of like, I'd almost call it the category of what your currency is. So like if you're trading information, but then all of a sudden somebody finds a new cheaper way to make a nuclear warhead, everybody's going to want that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Information is great, but only to a degree. Same with gold coins. Gold coins are great, but the minute somebody figures out a new way to cast magic more quickly, suddenly magic power becomes the currency of the setting.
That's
And that's
something
just,
actually I had happen in my own setting is that magic created this situation where it made the currency obsolete because a spell was invented to duplicate gold, and gold was now pointless. There was no point for gold unless you were decorative or didn't want an object to tarnish, because anyone with enough magic and the right spell could duplicate it. You just kind of stuff up the whole exchange system. Your gold coins don't really have any value when anyone can counterfeit them with wave of a hand. So you had to find another solution. And in my world, it was they found a different metal that cannot be duplicated with a magic, but there was quite a bit of chaos in between because your economy will really struggle. And like you mentioned as being a thing, your one nation finds this solution, then it's going to cascade along the system, presuming, of course, that information flow is happening in that regard. You've got to have connection between these nations. They can't psychically know that the neighbors next door have discovered
yeah.
gold.
there's there's also the issue of colonization and imperialism too.
Mm-hmm.
You can straight up see historical patterns of like historical Rome was using coins, and because of them, a lot of Europe is using coins because it's a holdover from when Imperial Rome just took over everything. Um, and it's one of those deals where like when you have two nations come into conflict, when you have two different peoples come into conflict, the winner writes history, and that
Mm-hmm.
includes the use of currency as well. The winner will determine what's important, unfortunately, and usually that means at the detriment of the loser in that conflict's
Mm.
currency or culture or so on and so forth. So, in some cases, to answer FR's question, it might not be an instance that the resource ran out. It might just be an instance that the resource is deemed no longer important enough.
Mm.
There might be a big cultural shift or a big new introduction. There's tons of things that could do it, which is why currency is like, even in the real world, it's reaching a really strange point right now because we saw the whole Bitcoin thing take off. And for some reason, Bitcoin got ridiculously valuable for something that has no physical presence.
Mm.
Like it effectively does not exist beyond a collection of photons, but it was still valuable for some ridiculous reason. Um, Artwork in the real world has no reason to have any monetary value assigned to it, but it does.
Mm.
And it can effectively become its own currency in art circles. Um, Weapons are another thing that can become a huge currency in settings, weapon trades. If you have very nationalistic themes going on, which is something I do also play with in my setting, the idea of coming together as a nation and doing so through violent means is unfortunately a thing that happens. So, deeming what's important and a currency running out, sometimes the currency runs out, sometimes people's interest in the currency runs out.
Mm.
And both can have the same impact or both can have wildly different impacts depending.
Mm. If anyone have any closing questions, because we're getting near to the end, please
Mhm.
send them through, and the magic production assistant Andy will pass them through to us. Um, I think in closing, there's not much more that we haven't covered. I think this has been a great discussion. But something I was going to mention quickly on that one is we've had that happen in real life. For example, I believe it was one of the Germanys or Poland that devalued, or it might have been Hungary even. It was a European country that their currency devalued so much that it was more, the paper was more useful as a heating material than the currency. And
Yep.
people ended up just burning it to stay warm instead of paying for anything with it because it was so incredibly inflated that they couldn't buy anything with it. So
Yep.
that could be one consequence. Um, but yeah, getting your questions. If you've got any, hopefully this has been useful to everyone as well. Um, do you have anything you think is kind of a pitfall you've seen a lot of people fall into when it comes to currency?
Um, I think this is gonna sound really dismissive of the entire conversation we just had, but I think people get a little too caught up in how important currency is to their setting and how important it is to their story. I
Mm,
think going into designing a currency, you have to have a clear understanding of just how important it is so that you know what the cutoff point is.
mm,
If you're writing a narrative, you have to know, okay, this is all it's used for, this is all I'm going to mention it for, and that's it.
mm,
If you're building a setting, this is all it's used for, this is all I'm going to mention it for, and that's it. Because the minute you start dropping like exchange rates and all that stuff, as we mentioned earlier, people are just going to tune it out. And it's not that, and this is me personally as a consumer of media, it's not that I don't want to see that in media, it's that I don't want to see your work go to waste.
mm.
Because there's a lot of information out there that just gets wasted in storytelling, unfortunately, because it's the 90% that people are trying to include in the 10% because they think it's cool, and it's just not entirely necessary.
Yeah. No, you've got to make sure, in my opinion, that your narrative, whichever it is, whether it's an RPG or story or uh, prose, by story I mean prose, or a film, that what you create is the right thing for your setting, in my opinion. And how much you create of it is how much your setting needs. If you're writing something really light and comedic, I I don't think you would usually build a lot of currency. If you're creating a setting where trade is really useful, for example, the anime Spice and Wolf is literally just about trade, then it is
So,
important to a certain degree. Um, but if you're creating, and in Dark Souls, it's important because it's the entire motivation of your character. But if
mhm.
you're creating a setting, for example, your average shonen anime, where it is not really an aspect of the character cares about, then you don't have to build all that. For example, oh, Harry Potter. Yes, the currency system is kind of confusing and arbitrary, but also it didn't matter to the story. It
Nope.
the success of the story was not affected by how terrible the currency system was. Though to be fair, a lot of things about Harry Potter were terrible that didn't affect the story, but the world
Yeah.
building falls to pieces in moments if you look at it deep, but you didn't have to enjoy the narrative.
Yeah. We do have a question. It's from Kajitan98. I'm probably butchering that, but it's what about ration cards as a currency? Yeah, ration cards could work.
Yeah.
Um, Trading food, definitely a base resource. Like any kind of thing for that is very important. Oh, one good example of things where like the entire game is based on currency is Settlers of Catan,
Mm.
because you can trade pretty much anything in that game, and it's one of the biggest board games in existence right now. It's one of the most played things around, but you can trade any kind of resource you have available to you, and all of a sudden that becomes a currency for you to win.
Mm.
Like
You
it's
you can build a lot more when it's useful to your narrative, and don't build too much when it's not.
yeah, monetize it just enough. Don't throw in any microtransactions, and make sure nothing's a pre-order bonus.
Hmm. And that's how you world build.
Exactly. Ah, man, that might be a good one to wrap on.
Yep. I've got some awesome stream thanks to thank, I guess. So there's our people who subscribe to our Twitch. Give us bits, follows, hosts. You guys are amazing. If you didn't know, if you're a subscriber or you're new to subscribing, make sure to sync your Discord and your Twitch accounts because you get a private, cool channel in our Discord. You also get an awesome set of emotes to use on any Discord server. So go spread those hype Wanvil chants. So thank you to myself because I subscribed before this began. Amethyst DM, thank you so much, and Hefe, you're amazing. Thank you. I caught a bit of Hefe's stream before this, and it was great. And Bits, Basic Dragon, Miladaman, and for hosting us, Hefe, thank you so much for that, guys. You really help us be able to do these streams. They do take a lot of time, and we really appreciate the support you guys give by coming along, asking questions, giving bits, subscribing, followers. Um, we will be heading over to the wonderful Arcadum's channel. He is a professional DM. I'm not quite sure what he's up to today, but it'll always be interesting. So we will be raiding him after this stream finishes and wraps up. I want to say huge thank you, Crow, for coming along. If you can drop the Twitter and the World Anvil for our access in chat, Andy or Basic Dragon, that would be so wonderful of you guys. I really recommend you go follow him on Twitter, follow his World Anvil World because it's great. You can also check out the Dice Nights podcast that he's involved with. Enjoy some entertainment. And I want to say a big thank you to Andy and Basic Dragon who did production for this stream as well.
Yes.
And
They've
yeah,
done a fantastic job. They've been putting links everywhere as I've been keeping an eye on things. Actually, I'm going to drop one last link in chat. This is to the stream I'm a part of. If I could spell Twitch right, that'd be great. .tv slash can't remember if it's Tainted Lands or the Tainted Lands. Hold please.
no worries.
This is the horror stream I'm a part of that I mentioned briefly earlier. You can also find us by the same name on YouTube. There we go.
Go watch on YouTube and subscribe. Thank you so much for coming along. Sadly, our other guest couldn't make it because of family emergency, and I was so happy to have you at least when we couldn't have a three-man band. But it was really enjoyable. I hope it's taught some people a bit about what to do for currency. Maybe and do your challenge articles now, guys. Hopefully you'll create something shiny and wonderful.
Hashtag Crow's the prettiest consolation prize. I'm just kidding. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Andy, I presume will be starting up our raid to Arcadum, as I don't have Twitch open. I'm so grateful for everyone. I really enjoy this. I wish these streams weren't at stupid o'clock in the morning, but they are, so I have to be awake up for them.
I'm sorry in advance, but if you ever want me back on, you know where to find me.
Yeah, thank you. It'd be wonderful to have you back sometime.
Awesome.
See you guys. Oop, I just hit my microphone. Sorry about that. See you guys. Thank you for coming along. I don't know if my hand can be seen there because I think this part of the screen is cut off, but thank you guys. Talk to you again maybe next week. See you.
Bye.